The warm golden light spilled across every table inside a high-end restaurant on the outskirts of Boston, the place Sophie had booked weeks in advance to celebrate the most important milestone of her life, her master's graduation in finance from Columbia University. At 27, she thought she had come a long way, surviving countless sleepless nights and the endless juggling between work and study, only to finally wear the graduation gown she had dreamed of for years. The soft clink of crystal champagne flutes and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air as Sophie sat at the head of the table, her graduation cap placed carefully beside her plate. The restaurant had an elegant atmosphere with its panoramic windows overlooking a serene swimming pool, illuminated by underwater lights that cast rippling blue shadows across the patio. Inside, candles flickered on each table, their flames dancing in perfect crystal holders. Yet even on the night that was supposed to belong to her, Sophie felt like an outsider. Every glance, every word of praise at the table was not directed at her, but instead at Claire, her sister, the so-called perfect daughter in her parents' eyes. They marveled at her expensive dress, at the glossy photos she had just posted on social media, as if this dinner had been arranged to honor her, rather than the years of hard work Sophie had put in. "Your sister always knows how to present herself," her mother said, leaning across the table to squeeze Claire's hand. "I swear, Claire, that dress must have cost a fortune, but you wear it so well." Sophie sat quietly, forcing a polite smile, telling herself she had long been used to it. But the bitterness still rose and lodged heavy in her chest, a familiar weight she had carried for as long as she could remember. She watched as her father pulled out his phone to show everyone at the table the latest pictures of Claire's boutique pride, evident in every word, as he described how successful his eldest daughter had become. No one mentioned Sophie's graduation honors, or the prestigious firm that had already shown interest in her resume. No one asked about the late nights she had spent hunched over textbooks while working part-time to cover expenses. Her scholarship didn't. When dessert arrived, elegantly plated chocolate soufflés with gold leaf garnish, the spark that ignited everything happened. Noah, Claire's 10-year-old son, suddenly dashed around the table and stopped right behind Sophie. In front of everyone, he snatched the designer purse she had left on her chair. A purse she had saved for months to buy a small reward to herself for her hard work, and tossed it straight into the swimming pool nearby. "Mom says you don't deserve nice things." His voice rang out gleeful and cruel. In an instant, the table erupted with laughter. Claire laughed until tears rolled down her face, while Sophie's parents nearly doubled over, wiping their eyes as they praised him. "Kids are just so honest and adorable." Not one person defended her. Not a single apology was spoken. Sophie sat there feeling their laughter slice through her ears like tiny blades, but she kept her smile frozen in place. Then she stood up silent without protest, scanning the room one last time before lowering her gaze. Deep down, she knew this was more than just a ruined dinner. It was the final punctuation mark on all her futile efforts to belong to a family that had never truly seen her as one of their own. The waiter approached with concern in his eyes, having witnessed the scene. "Miss, I can have someone retrieve your purse from the pool." "Thank you, but don't worry about it," Sophie replied quietly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She placed enough cash on the table to cover her portion of the meal, then walked out without looking back, leaving behind the sound of her family's continuing laughter. As she drove through the quiet Boston streets, streetlights blurred through her unshed tears. Sophie allowed her mind to wander back through the years to trace the path that had led to this moment. "My childhood was never truly mine," she whispered to herself as she drove. From the moment she was old enough to understand, she had felt Claire's shadow stretching over her life. Claire was 3 years older, always the center of every party, every conversation at home, every proud glance from their parents. When Claire turned 16, the whole neighborhood buzzed about the bright red car their parents bought her. Sophie still remembered that evening clearly. Neighbors came over to take pictures, friends rushed in cheering, and she stood quietly on the porch, holding a book, forcing a smile. The car was covered with a white cloth. Their parents counted down and pulled it away. The house erupted in applause, and Sophie heard someone whisper, "Claire is truly the pride of the hearts." No one asked what Sophie was thinking. No one cared that she had just won first place in the school speech contest that day. In their eyes, her academic achievements meant nothing compared to the radiant image of her sister beside her new car. That year, Claire's birthday was an extravagant backyard party, with strings of lights across the trees, a live band, and more than 50 guests. Sophie wore an old dress her mother told her to make do with because it was still fine, and she stood handing out pastries to her sister's friends. When Sophie's birthday came around, it was reduced to a simple family dinner and a hastily written greeting card. Her mother said, "You've never liked big fusses, so this is more appropriate." She didn't argue. She nodded and told herself she didn't need much. But deep inside, she longed to be seen, to have a party where her name was spoken to be the main character just once. That longing slowly turned into a persistent, smoldering emptiness that lasted throughout her childhood. In high school, Sophie studied day and night always at the top of her class, earning full scholarships for summer programs. Each time a letter of achievement arrived, she handed it to her parents, with excitement, hoping to see their faces light up with pride. But their usual response was only, "Well done, Sophie, but you'll need to take care of yourself. Claire is different. She has leadership qualities. You should learn from her." Sophie still remembered the first time she received a full scholarship for college, an achievement that had not come easily. She came home hands trembling as she opened the envelope in front of the whole family. At that moment, Claire was busy showing off her new photo online, racking up hundreds of likes. Her parents barely glanced at Sophie's scholarship letter before turning their attention to comment on Claire's modern sense of style. Sophie forced a smile, hiding her disappointment. But deep down she knew the truth. She was nothing more than a quiet shadow, standing behind the stage illuminating the main character Claire. The older Sophie grew, the clearer the distance became. When she was accepted into Columbia with a prestigious scholarship, her mother only said, "If you're so capable, then handle it yourself. You've always been financially independent." But when Claire dropped out of college, their parents immediately funded a fashion boutique for her right in the center of Boston. They bragged to their friends, "Our eldest daughter is starting her own business. She has true entrepreneurial spirit." No one mentioned that Sophie was working nights in the library and tutoring on weekends to cover living expenses even with the scholarship. In this family, Claire was the pride, while Sophie was simply the one who managed on her own, a flattering phrase that barely concealed their neglect. The breaking point came the year Claire wanted to buy a luxury SUV. She didn't qualify for credit because of her mounting debts, and Kevin, her husband, was unemployed. Sophie knew all of that, and she also knew she should have said no. But one evening, her father sat across from her, his voice low and heavy with pressure. "Sophie, you're good with finances. Your credit is strong. Just co-sign. It'll only take a few months. This is for the family. Nothing serious." Sophie froze in that moment. Memories of every time she had been belittled, compared, and overlooked flooded back. But her father's unwavering stare, paired with her mother's nod, as if this were the most natural expectation in the world, made her relent. She signed the papers, her heart sinking feeling as if she had just tightened another chain around her own neck. Sophie didn't want to argue, didn't want to be branded selfish, so she chose silence, just as she always had. Claire jumped with joy, hugging their parents tightly, while Sophie sat there, forcing a stiff smile, feeling trapped in a role she never asked for. From that moment on, Sophie understood she was not only dismissed, but also exploited. Her academic achievements had never been enough to make them proud, yet her spotless credit record was more than enough for them to depend on whenever they needed a loan. She wasn't the child they loved. She was simply a convenient tool. And slowly, the fragile hope she had carried for a warm home crumbled, leaving her with only one undeniable truth. She had always lived in a family where fairness never truly existed. Now driving away from the restaurant into the night, heading back to her small apartment with a lingering ache in her chest, Sophie felt something changing inside her. Boston streets were quiet at that hour, the streetlights stretching into mottled streaks across the pavement. She parked in front of the old brick building and climbed the familiar narrow stairs to her little second-floor apartment. When the door closed behind her, a heavy silence settled in a stark contrast to the loud, mocking laughter that still echoed in her head. Sophie dropped her bag onto the worn sofa and sank down, as if her body had no strength left. The faces from the dinner table kept replaying in her mind: Claire's triumphant smirk, her parents clutching their stomachs laughing, until tears came, the others nodding along and joining in. No one paused to consider that she was being humiliated. No one stood up for her. The whole dinner, where she had hoped to hear congratulations, had become a stage for publicly ridiculing her. For years, she had grown accustomed to being belittled, but this time, beneath the pool's cold, shimmering light and the reverberating laughter, Sophie no longer felt sadness. She only saw one undeniable truth: she had never belonged to this family, and she never would. She let her eyes wander around her tiny apartment. Everything was simple and worn, yet each item had been bought with money she had earned herself. The wooden table with its scratches, the bookshelf crammed full of papers, the old yellow desk lamp, all of it stood as proof of the independent life she had struggled to build piece by piece. Unlike Claire's spacious house not far from here, filled with luxury items, Sophie's apartment wasn't glamorous, but at least it was hers. And in that very moment, she knew she had to do something decisive to cut the final chain that bound her to them. Sophie opened her laptop, her hands trembling slightly as the keyboard lit up in the darkness. The bank's website appeared so familiar, she could navigate it by heart. For years, she had quietly logged in to check on the loan she had co-signed for Claire. Each time she did, her heart clenched at the sight of a debt that wasn't hers. Yet she stayed silent, swallowed her tears, and told herself it was the price of keeping peace in the family. But tonight, Sophie no longer wanted silence. She moved the cursor to the section titled Loan Guarantor. There the words appeared: the guarantor has the right to request removal from the contract under certain conditions. Sophie drew in a deep breath. In her mind, she heard her father's voice. You studied finance. Your credit is strong. Help your sister. Then her mother's, you're tough. You don't need much. And Claire's mocking tone. All you've got are books. The things that really matter are mine. For years, she had let those words shackle her. A confirmation box popped up. Are you sure you want to be removed as guarantor from this contract? This action cannot be undone. Sophie sat motionless in front of the screen, her heart pounding. In her mind, images flashed in sequence: Sophie at 16 watching Claire receive the car, Sophie at 22 trembling as she signed the loan papers, and Sophie tonight watching her purse thrown into the pool. All of it led to this moment. She pressed enter on the screen. The status changed. Her name vanished from the guarantor list. One click, but it felt as if she had just ripped apart a chain that had bound her for years. Sophie sat there stunned, then began to cry. Not tears of fear or despair, but of relief. Tears fell onto the keyboard while she laughed through sobs. She had done something she had never dared to imagine before she had chosen herself over her family. The little apartment suddenly felt different. It remained simple and modest, still lacking in many comforts, but it was filled with a sense of freedom. For the first time, Sophie felt truly in control of her life, no longer bearing someone else's debt, no longer dreading every account check. She leaned back on the sofa, stared at the worn ceiling, and whispered to herself, "From now on, I am free." The next morning, Sophie sat by the window as the first sunlight filtered through the old curtains. She hadn't slept all night yet. Her body buzzed with a strange energy. Deep down, she knew her decision the night before would have consequences, and they arrived sooner than she had expected. At 7:30 a.m., her phone buzzed nonstop with a flood of notifications. In the neighborhood group chat, people were buzzing with gossip. A pearl white luxury SUV had just been repossessed from Claire's driveway by the finance company. Within minutes, photos appeared: shots of the car being hooked up to a tow crane, the tires screeching against the cement, while neighbors stood at a distance secretly recording with their phones. Someone commented, "Can't believe the Hearts let this happen. That car wasn't even paid off yet and already got taken." As Sophie looked at those images, what she felt wasn't satisfaction, but a cold certainty. The illusion of safety that had always surrounded her family had finally shattered. At exactly 8:15, A furious pounding rattled her door, each knock so forceful it felt like someone wanted to break it down. Sophie walked over, her heart oddly calm. When she opened the door, there stood Claire. Her face was pale, the usually perfect golden waves of her hair, now a tangled mess. Her makeup smeared after what must have been a night of tears and rage. In her hands, she clutched crumpled loan papers, shaking so hard the pages were nearly torn. "Where's my car, Sophie?" she yelled, her voice shrill and echoing down the hallway. "What do you think you're doing? Are you destroying this whole family over a childish prank?" Sophie didn't answer. She stood motionless in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the wooden frame, neither inviting her sister in, nor stepping outside. That small space suddenly became an invisible boundary. On one side, the old Sophie who had endured and stayed silent for years. On the other, the person she was now, the one who had just cut the final tether. Claire kept shouting, tears streaking down her face. "Noah is just a child. He said something stupid. So why are you being so heartless? Are you even my sister anymore? Do you even understand what family means?" Her words poured out accusation, pleading fury. But beneath them, Sophie heard another tone, fear. Claire knew that the repossession was only the beginning. Without Sophie on the loan, all the luxuries she wrapped around herself would start to crumble. And she knew this time Sophie would not come back to rescue her. Claire thrust the crumpled loan papers forward, shaking as if she wanted to force them into Sophie's hands. "You signed these. You have a responsibility. You can't just remove yourself like this. You're embarrassing us in front of the neighbors, driving Kevin crazy. Do you want to watch this family fall apart and be satisfied?" Sophie looked at her with calm eyes. She remembered all the nights she collapsed over her desk, worried about loan deadlines. All the time she heard her parents say, "Claire needs the help, you'll be fine." Those memories only made her stronger. She still didn't say a word. Her silence now was the clearest answer she could give. Claire seemed to spiral further into panic. She sobbed, her voice breaking. "What do you even get out of this? To prove you're stronger than me, you're only tearing everything apart." But this time her tears had no effect. Sophie was no longer the timid younger sister afraid of upsetting Claire. She saw it clearly, the balance of power had shifted. Sophie shook her head gently, then slowly closed the door. Not with anger, not with a slam, but with a quiet finality of ending an old chapter. Claire's pounding continued on the other side, mixed with sobs and curses. But Sophie had already turned away and stepped back inside. She sat down in her chair, her heartbeat slow and steady. What she felt wasn't triumph, but a strange, profound stillness. For the first time, she understood freedom as something more than a word. Freedom from being held hostage, freedom from guilt for choosing herself. Out there, Claire could scream. Her parents could rage. The neighbors could gossip. But behind this door, Sophie knew she had stepped out of the invisible cage. And even though this was only the beginning, she was ready. Sophie thought that after the chaos of the morning when the SUV was towed away, things would quiet down. But she was wrong. In the days that followed, her phone turned into a battlefield. In the morning, her father called, his voice sharp as steel. "Sophie, you need to fix this mistake right now. Do you realize you've humiliated this family in front of the neighbors? What do you want people to think of us?" By noon, her mother's voice came through trembling. "Sweetheart, I know you're angry, but Noah is just a child. You can't ruin everything over this. Family is still family. Please don't push things further." By evening, Claire was screaming into the phone. "Are you happy now seeing me walk in the rain? You've embarrassed me. You've made my child a target of jokes. You're cruel, Sophie." The calls came like crashing waves, threats followed by pleading, fury followed by sobs. Sophie let the phone buzz unanswered. At first, her heart still trembled, her finger hovering over the answer button before pulling back. But gradually, her silence became its own weapon. The more they shouted, the more she realized the power had shifted into her hands. She had the right to choose not to step back into that toxic cycle ever again. But it didn't stop with the phone calls. One evening, when Sophie opened TikTok, she froze at the sight of a video Noah had shared that was spreading among his friends. In the clip, he laughed gleefully as he threw her purse into the pool and shouted, "Mom says you don't deserve nice things." Then the camera panned to the dinner table where her parents and Claire clapped and roared with laughter. Noah had added mocking background music and a caption across the screen, "Auntie Sophie equals invisible wallet." The video was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to twist Sophie's heart. Looking at Claire's 10-year-old son, she saw clearly that his arrogance wasn't something he was born with. It was the result of what her family had planted in him. In the days that followed, Sophie walked the streets with the constant feeling that everyone knew. She couldn't be sure who outside the family had watched the video, but the shame seemed to seep into every breath she took. She slipped quietly into the library, quietly back home, trying to ignore the mocking messages sent to her inbox from anonymous accounts. Then one night, returning from her part-time job, Sophie found her small car parked in front of the building had been scratched deeply along the side. Long, sharp gouges carved into the paint like a warning. The shock hadn't even settled when she noticed the passenger window shattered, shards of glass scattered across the seat. Sophie stood frozen, the night air rushing through the broken pane and raising goosebumps across her skin. This was no longer a prank. This was deliberate destruction. She rushed upstairs to her apartment and pulled up the building security system that the landlord had installed. Her heart pounded as she rewound the footage from that evening. And then the images appeared in stark clarity, Noah alongside another boy his age, clutching stones and hurling them directly at her car. They laughed as they filmed themselves pointing, grinning, and high-fiving like they had just accomplished some great victory. Watching it, a chill ran through Sophie. This was the same child whose birthdays she had bought presents for, the same boy she had once taken to the park. And now he had become a fearless vandal who thought destruction was entertainment. Sophie sank into a chair, her eyes glued to the screen. A flood of questions hammered in her head. How could a 10-year-old act like this? Why hadn't the adults taught him right from wrong? Why had they encouraged him instead? And then the answer struck her with painful clarity. Because her family had turned her into a joke, turning her humiliation into their shared amusement. Noah was nothing more than a reflection of what the adults had sown. The anger inside Sophie was no longer a quiet ember. It erupted sharp and undeniable. She knew that if she kept staying silent, it wouldn't end here. Today, it was scratches on her car and a shattered window. Tomorrow, it could be her apartment. Tomorrow, it could be her. She couldn't wait for that moment to finally fight back. Sophie leaned back in her chair and took a deep breath. Outside the window, the city still blazed with lights, the traffic flowing like an endless river. Inside her small apartment, she whispered to herself, "Enough. I will not stay silent one more time." Sophie sat in the dark with her phone in hand, her thumb trembling slightly as it hovered over the name Julia. For years, Julia had been the only person who witnessed her struggle in silence. Julia was not only a close college friend, but also a young, courageous lawyer who had chosen to defend justice, even when it meant confronting falsehoods. Sophie inhaled deeply and pressed call. "Sophie, are you calling at this hour?" Julia's familiar, steady voice came through. Sophie could not hold back and told her everything from the beginning to the end. The humiliating evening at her graduation dinner, her purse thrown into the pool, the barrage of phone calls, the mocking TikTok video, then her car scratched and the window shattered. When she described Noah and his friend laughing in the security footage, her voice broke. "Julia, I don't know what to do. They're my family. But if I stay silent, I'm afraid next time it won't be just the car." On the other end, there was a few seconds of silence. Then Julia spoke slowly but firmly. "Sophie, if you let this go, they'll think you have no worth. They'll disrespect you even more, and these actions will only keep happening and escalate. This is no longer a family matter. It's criminal behavior." Sophie went still. Julia's words awakened something in her. For years, she had hidden behind the excuse of keeping the peace, convincing herself that silence would protect her. But the truth was the opposite. Her silence had made her the target. Julia continued, "Tomorrow we'll go to the police station together. Bring all the evidence, the TikTok video, the security footage, and the threatening messages. You're not alone in this." For the first time since the dinner, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. Not for reconciliation with her family, but for justice, for the chance to reclaim her dignity, for the opportunity to stand up and say no to being everyone's doormat. She ended the call and walked to the window of her apartment. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the night sky, each one a reminder that beyond the small, toxic circle of her family, a whole world existed, one where she might finally be valued for who she was. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "everything changes." The morning after Sophie removed herself as lone guarantor, Julia arrived outside her apartment at exactly 8:30 a.m., wearing a simple black suit, a folder tucked firmly under her arm. When she saw Sophie, she didn't waste time with small talk. She just placed her hand on Sophie's shoulder, her eyes steady. "Let's go." As they drove to the police station, Sophie stared out the window watching the city come alive. The morning light cast long shadows across the streets, people rushing to work, unaware of the battle she was about to fight. A battle against her own family. "Are you sure about this?" Julia asked, her voice gentle but firm. Sophie nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I've been silent my whole life. Where has that gotten me?" They arrived at the district police headquarters. The room was cold and bright with gray walls and the lingering scent of stale coffee. Sophie's heart pounded harder with every step. When the duty officer asked why they were there, she hesitated for a moment, but Julia stepped forward without pause. She opened her laptop and showed him the TikTok clip. Noah tossing Sophie's purse into the pool as the table erupted in laughter. The officer's face grew serious. Then Julia played the security footage, Noah and his friend hurling rocks at Sophie's car, the window shattering, their laughter piercing through the recording. This time, the officer's neutrality vanished. He nodded firmly. "That's enough. This can't be dismissed as childish mischief anymore." Sophie clenched her hands together, trying to steady herself. The officer pulled out a case file, flipped through a few pages, then looked at her. "Actually, we've received prior complaints from neighbors about this boy Noah Hart throwing things at doors, scratching cars, causing trouble, but there was never any solid evidence. This time is different. Your footage is undeniable." Sophie froze, caught between pain and anger. So this wasn't the first time Noah had acted like this. But because he was the golden boy in Claire's and her parents' eyes, everything had always been covered up. Now the truth stood exposed, impossible to deny. Julia placed Sophie's prepared file on the desk. "In addition, we're requesting an investigation into the loan signed under Sophie's name without her consent. But for now, we demand immediate action on the deliberate property damage." The officer nodded, taking detailed notes before handing Sophie a statement form. Her hands trembled as she held the pen. But with every signature she wrote, she felt herself growing steadier. She recounted everything from the dinner humiliation to the night she found her car vandalized. When she finished and signed, she lifted her head and looked the officer straight in the eye. "I don't want to stay silent anymore." He nodded back. "You've done the right thing. We will move forward. With this evidence, Noah will be placed in a juvenile rehabilitation program at the very least, to understand that his actions carry consequences." On the way home, Sophie sat quietly beside Julia. Outside the window, the city bustled with life. But inside her, a new feeling swelled. She no longer felt fear, no longer felt like she was fighting alone. She had just taken a giant step forward, a step she had never dared to take in all these years. Julia tilted her head toward her with a gentle smile. "See, the moment you spoke up, the balance shifted. No one has the right to trample you anymore." Sophie nodded, her eyes stinging, but her chest lighter than it had been in years. When Sophie returned to her apartment, she found 17 missed calls on her phone, 5 from her father, 7 from her mother, and 5 from Claire. Voicemails filled her inbox, each more desperate than the last. Her father's voice was sharp and cutting. "The police came to their house, Sophie. The police. Do you have any idea what you've done? What people will think? Call me back immediately." Her mother's message came next, tearful and pleading. "Sweetheart, this has gone too far. Noah is just a little boy. He made a mistake. We can fix the car, replace the purse. Please don't do this to your sister, to your family. Claire's voicemail was the worst. Her voice trembled with both fury and fear. They're talking about putting my son in some kind of program. Are you insane? He's 10 years old. You're destroying his future because your feelings got hurt. You were always jealous of me, but I never thought you'd stoop this low. Sophie listened to each message, her hands steady as she held the phone. With each word, the lingering doubt in her mind dissipated. Their concern wasn't for her, for the harm done to her property or dignity. It was for their reputation, for maintaining the facade they had built. She deleted the messages one by one without returning a single call. That evening, as she made herself a simple dinner, there was a sharp knock at her door. Through the peephole, she saw her father standing in the hallway, his face set in a hard expression she knew all too well, the face he wore when he was about to make demands disguised as reasonable requests. Sophie took a deep breath and opened the door, but only halfway, standing firmly in the opening. "We need to talk," her father said without preamble. "I'm listening," Sophie replied, not inviting him inside. His eyebrows rose in surprise at her response. Usually she would have stepped aside immediately, eager to please. "Not in the hallway, Sophie, let me in." "I'm comfortable talking here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "What do you want to discuss?" His face reddened. "This nonsense with the police has to stop immediately. Do you have any idea what you've done? Noah is devastated. Claire is being stared at by the neighbors. Your mother hasn't stopped crying. Is this what you wanted, to tear apart your family?" "No," Sophie answered honestly. "I wanted to stop being the family's silent wallet. I wanted consequences for actions that hurt me. I wanted to be treated with basic respect." "This isn't about respect," he snapped. "This is about family loyalty. You're supposed to support your sister, not try to destroy her son's future." "What about my future?" Sophie asked. "What about the loans taken in my name without my knowledge? What about the humiliation at my own graduation dinner? What about my car that Noah vandalized while filming himself laughing?" Her father waved a dismissive hand. "Cars can be fixed. Kids make mistakes. But what you're doing now will leave permanent damage." Sophie looked at him and realized something that should have been obvious years ago in his eyes. Damage to her didn't count. Her pain, her financial security, her dignity were all expendable. Only Claire mattered. Only Noah mattered. "I won't be dropping the charges," Sophie said firmly. "And I'm having all fraudulent loans investigated. If you came here to persuade me otherwise, you've wasted your time." For a moment, her father looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then his expression hardened. "If you go through with this, you're no longer part of this family. Do you understand me? You'll be completely cut off." A strange calm settled over Sophie. "I've been cut off my entire life, Dad. The only difference now is that I'm choosing it instead of having it forced upon me." She closed the door gently but firmly, then leaned against it, her heart racing, but her mind clear. Through the door, she could hear her father's heavy footsteps receding down the hallway. In that moment, she knew there was no turning back. The bridge was burning, but she wasn't the one who had lit the match. They had been scorching it for years. The following week brought a new kind of storm. Sophie had expected the anger, the pleading, the threats. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly her family would escalate matters once they realized she wouldn't back down. It began with a single email from her alma mater. The alumni office reached out to verify whether she had requested to have her graduation records sealed. Sophie stared at the screen in disbelief before calling the office directly. "Yes, Ms. Hart," the administrator confirmed. "We received a request from someone claiming to be you, stating privacy concerns about your academic record. They provided enough personal information that we nearly processed it. Fortunately, our protocol requires direct verification." Sophie thanked the woman and hung up, her mind racing. Someone had tried to erase her academic achievements, the very accomplishments she had worked so hard for. There was only one explanation: her family was retaliating in the most personal way possible. That same day, she received a call from the investment firm that had been interested in hiring her. The hiring manager sounded uncomfortable. "Ms. Hart, we've received some concerning information about you. Someone reached out to us claiming to be a former professor of yours, suggesting there were ethics violations during your time at Columbia. We take these allegations seriously, but wanted to speak with you directly before making any decisions. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. That's completely false, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I can provide you with contact information for all my actual professors. I graduated with honors and have never had an ethics violation of any kind. The call ended with vague reassurances, but Sophie knew the damage was already seeping into her professional prospects. Someone was systematically trying to destroy everything she had built. That night, Sophie called Julia, her voice tight with controlled fury. They're trying to erase me. My academic records, my job prospects. They're attacking everything I've worked for. Julia's response was immediate and determined. Document everything. Every call, every email, every attempt. This is harassment and potential defamation. We're adding it to the case. The next morning, Sophie and Julia met for coffee at a small cafe far from Sophie's neighborhood, hoping to avoid any unwanted encounters. I think we need to look deeper into your financial records, Julia said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. If they're willing to go this far to silence you, there might be more financial abuse than just the car loan. Sophie nodded slowly. I've always been careful with my money, but I've never really audited my entire financial history. After all, they're my family. I never thought I needed to protect myself from them. That evening, they spread everything across Sophie's kitchen table. Bank statements, loan contracts, credit notices, papers she had long avoided opening because each time she did it felt like a knife tightening in her chest. Julia sat across from her laptop open, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. We'll go through every item. If there's something off, we'll find it, she said firmly. From the very first pages, Julia's brow furrowed. She pointed to a consumer loan agreement dated 3 years ago. Sophie, do you remember ever signing this $12,000 for electronic equipment? Sophie shook her head, stunned. No, at that time I was still in grad school in New York. I wasn't even in Boston, and I had no need for that money. Julia typed quickly, pulling up a comparison between the signature on the contract and Sophie's real signature from her driver's license. The differences were so stark that a chill ran down Sophie's spine. The writing on the contract was crude, rigid, an obvious attempt to mimic, but never truly match hers. Then they continued. Another loan appeared in Sophie's name, $8,500 supposedly for home renovations. Sophie remembered the time Claire posted on social media that she and Kevin had remodeled their kitchen. She had wondered how they could afford it, then let it go. Now the answer was right in front of her. They had used her name. Julia didn't need an expert to conclude, this signature is forged too. Page after page, line after line, the truth unfolded, and Sophie's stomach twisted. It wasn't just one or two instances, but a string of loans. Personal loans, lines of credit, even credit cards she had never opened. The total ran into tens of thousands of dollars. All of it bore her name, relying on her clean financial record to get approved. And the cruelest part, her parents and Claire and Kevin had carried this out quietly without telling her. For years, she had believed she was only being belittled, left out at parties, pushed to the margins of attention. Now she realized the truth was far harsher. They had turned her into the family's invisible wallet, a clean name to hide their reckless spending and greed. Sophie sat frozen in her chair, her mind blank. The sensation of betrayal spread through her like an icy wave. Julia looked up, her eyes carrying both sadness and determination. She let out a heavy sigh. Her voice weighted with gravity. Sophie, this isn't just a family matter anymore. This is organized fraud. They forged your signature multiple times over several years. If we take this to court, this evidence will be undeniable. Sophie pressed her hands against her face as tears streamed down, though they no longer came with the same choking grief as before. What she felt was both pain and relief. Pain because the truth was brutal. Relief because it was finally uncovered. She remembered all those years she scraped together every dollar to pay tuition, while Claire flaunted luxury vacations, her parents showering her with praise for looking radiant. Sophie had blamed herself for not knowing how to enjoy life, But the reality was, they had been enjoying it under her name. Sophie lifted her head and looked at Julia. "If I bring this into the light, the family will fall apart." Her voice trembled not from hesitation, but from admitting something that had always been obvious. Julia placed her warm hand over Sophie's. "Family Sophie, a real family doesn't do this to their daughter. The only thing that will fall apart here is the false image they've built. You deserve a life free from lies and chains." Sophie took a deep breath and wiped away her tears. Inside her, a strange calm began to rise. For years, she had feared collapse, afraid of losing the few scraps of family ties she had left. But now she understood holding on to those scraps had only left her bleeding more. "I will take this to court," Sophie said clearly, "even if it means this family is completely destroyed." Julia nodded, her gaze bright with conviction. "That's the right decision, and you won't be alone. I'll be with you until the end." That night, Sophie gathered all the evidence into one neat file. Staring at those papers felt like staring at a verdict that had been hanging over her head for years, waiting to fall. But now she wasn't trembling anymore. She was ready to hold it in her hands, bring it into the light, and let justice speak for her. The following days brought a strange quiet. Sophie's phone, which had been ringing constantly with threats and pleas, fell silent. No messages from her mother, no angry calls from her father, no tearful voicemails from Claire. It was as if the Hart family had suddenly disappeared from her life. But Sophie knew better. This wasn't surrender. This was the calm before the storm. They were planning something, regrouping, perhaps consulting lawyers of their own. She used the respite to prepare herself. With Julia's help, she filed formal reports about the forged signatures and fraudulent loans. She contacted the 3 major credit bureaus to put a freeze on her credit, preventing any new accounts from being opened in her name. She changed all her passwords and set up new security questions, making sure to use information her family wouldn't know. One evening, as Sophie was leaving work, she spotted a familiar car parked across the street. Her mother sat behind the wheel, watching the building entrance. When their eyes met, her mother didn't wave or call out. She just stared, her face a mask of sorrow that Sophie might once have found heartbreaking. Now she only felt a dull ache. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, taking a longer route home to avoid any confrontation. She wasn't ready yet, not until everything was in place. 3 days later, the police called Sophie. Noah had been caught on another security camera, this time trying to break into the lobby of her apartment building. When confronted by the building manager, he had run off, but not before he was clearly identified. "We're taking this very seriously, Ms. Hart," the officer told her, "especially given the previous incidents. The juvenile court has scheduled a hearing and you'll need to be present to testify." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Noah, only 10 years old, already being shaped into someone who thought cruelty was strength, who believed that hurting others was how you proved your worth. She wondered if there was any chance to break that cycle, to help him see a different way before it was too late. The morning of the juvenile hearing arrived with a heavy gray sky threatening rain. Sophie dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, pulling her hair back into a neat ponytail. She wanted to look composed, dignified, not someone seeking revenge, but someone asking for justice. Julia picked her up early, squeezing her hand as Sophie slid into the passenger seat. "Remember," she said gently, "this isn't about punishing Noah. It's about getting him help before his behavior escalates further. You're doing the right thing." The juvenile court was smaller and less formal than Sophie had imagined, the atmosphere more subdued. As they entered the waiting area, Sophie saw Claire sitting on a bench, Noah beside her. The boy looked small and sullen, his eyes fixed on the floor. Claire's face was drawn and pale, her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. For a fleeting moment, Sophie's resolve wavered. This was her nephew, her sister, the people she had once loved without question, the family she had yearned to be truly part of. But then she remembered the laughter at the restaurant, the car scratches, the forged signatures, and her determination returned stronger than before. Claire looked up and noticed Sophie. For a second, their eyes met across the room. No words were exchanged, but in that brief glance, Sophie saw something she had never seen in her sister's eyes before: fear. Not just anxiety or worry, but genuine fear. Claire quickly looked away, drawing Noah closer to her side. The hearing itself was brief but consequential. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the security footage and the TikTok video that Noah had proudly shared. He listened to the testimony from both sides, his expression growing increasingly grave. Claire tried to paint the incidents as childish pranks that had been blown out of proportion. "He's just a kid who made some mistakes," she pleaded. "Kids do thoughtless things sometimes. He didn't understand the consequences." But when it was Sophie's turn to speak, she kept her testimony simple and direct. "This wasn't one isolated incident," she explained. "There's been a pattern of escalating behavior encouraged and even celebrated by his parents. Noah needs intervention now before these actions become who he is." The judge's decision was swift and firm. Noah would be required to attend a 2-year juvenile rehabilitation program, including therapy sessions and community service. His internet and social media access would be restricted and monitored. Most importantly, he would need to make direct amends to Sophie for the damage he had caused. As the hearing concluded, Sophie felt no triumph, only a sad certainty that this was necessary. As she gathered her belongings to leave, she saw Noah watching her, his expression a mix of confusion and resentment. Claire had an arm around him, whispering something in his ear, her eyes fixed on Sophie with undisguised hostility. Sophie turned away. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. The juvenile hearing was just the first step. Next would come the criminal and civil complaints against her parents and Claire for financial fraud. The road ahead would be long and painful, but Sophie was ready to walk it. That evening, as a soft rain finally began to fall outside her window, Sophie received an unexpected email. It was from the investment firm that had been considering her for a position. They had completed their due diligence and were satisfied that the allegations against her were unfounded. In fact, they were impressed by her integrity and resilience in the face of personal challenges. The position was still hers if she wanted it. Sophie stared at the screen, a cautious hope looming in her chest. Despite everything her family had tried to do, her professional future remained intact. They hadn't managed to take that away from her. The email contained one more piece of news. The position wasn't in Boston, but in their Chicago office. They were willing to cover relocation costs if she was interested in a fresh start. Chicago. Far from Boston, from the Hart family, from the neighbors who had witnessed her humiliation, from the apartment where she had spent so many nights feeling invisible and unwanted. A place where no one knew her as Claire's little sister, or the quiet one, or the smart one who keeps to herself. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before she began typing her response. A strange feeling washed over her as she accepted the offer, not exactly happiness, but something equally powerful possibility. Later that night, as Sophie began to research apartments in Chicago, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, fearing another trick from her family, but something made her pick up. "Is this Sophie Hart?" The voice was formal, professional. "Yes, speaking. This is Harold Jenkins from Hart Financial Services. I'm calling about some unusual activity we've detected on several accounts associated with your family. As the compliance officer for the bank, I'm required to investigate any patterns that might indicate financial impropriety." Sophie's heart raced. "What kind of activity?" "There appear to be significant transfers from accounts in your parents' names to offshore entities beginning shortly after a police report was filed regarding fraudulent loans. Ms. Hart, I'm calling because your name appears on some of these documents, though the signatures seem inconsistent with your other records." Now they were trying to implicate her in their financial misdeeds. Of course they would. Sophie closed her eyes briefly, then spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Mr. Jenkins, I've recently discovered multiple instances of identity theft and forgery committed against me by family members. I'm working with authorities and have substantial evidence to support this. I would be happy to come to your office tomorrow with my attorney to discuss this further and provide all the documentation you need." There was a pause on the other end. "That would be very helpful, Ms. Hart. This is a serious situation that requires immediate attention." After arranging a meeting for the following morning, Sophie hung up and immediately called Julia to fill her in. Her family was clearly panicking, possibly trying to hide assets or even flee financial responsibility. The walls were closing in on them, and they were getting desperate. "This is actually good news," Julia said after listening. "If they're making these kinds of moves, they know they can't win legally. They're scrambling. We've got them on the defensive." That night, Sophie stood at her window, watching the rain trace silver patterns down the glass. She thought about Chicago, about starting fresh in a new city, where she would be known only for who she was, not for being the lesser daughter, the convenient financial tool, the shadow to Claire's light. For the first time in her adult life, Sophie allowed herself to imagine a future defined entirely by her own choices, her own dreams. A life where she didn't have to make herself smaller to keep the peace, where her accomplishments wouldn't be brushed aside, where her boundaries would be respected. It wouldn't be easy. The court cases would drag on. The emotional wounds would take time to heal. There would be days when the loneliness of cutting ties with her entire family would feel overwhelming. But through it all, Sophie knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was finally breaking free from shadows that had dimmed her life for far too long. As she turned away from the window to begin packing, not just for the meeting tomorrow, but for the bigger journey ahead, Sophie caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't the same person who had sat silently at that graduation dinner, watching her purse sink to the bottom of a pool while her family laughed. That woman had disappeared, replaced by someone stronger, someone who refused to be invisible any longer. "You are Sophie Hart," she whispered to her reflection. "And from now on, no one decides your worth but you." The day of the trial came faster than Sophie had imagined. Within just a few weeks after the police completed their preliminary investigation and gathered the evidence, her case was officially brought before the district court. It was no longer a private family matter. It had become a real case widely reported in the local press for its financial fraud, the scale of deception, and the shocking clash between blood relatives. They called it the Hart family case, as if her last name itself had been turned into entertainment for the public. That morning, Sophie arrived at the courthouse with Julia. She wore a simple navy blue dress with no elaborate makeup. She wanted everyone to see her not as the abandoned daughter anymore, but as a calm woman standing up to defend herself. The entrance was packed with reporters' cameras flashing relentlessly in her direction. She heard someone call out, "Sophie, are you really suing your own family?" She gave no reply, only walked straight inside, her chin held high. In the courtroom, the two sides faced each other like opposing armies. Julia and Sophie sat on one side, a thick file of evidence laid out in front of them. Across the aisle, Claire sat squeezed between Kevin and Sophie's parents. She looked more haggard than Sophie had ever seen her, her blonde hair a tangled mess, her makeup streaked from tears. Sophie's father's face was rigid, his eyes sharp as if ready for battle. Her mother kept her head bowed, her hands trembling as they clutched a small prayer book. The distance between them felt both vast and strangely intimate, these people who shared her blood, but who had treated her like a stranger for so long. When the judge's gavel struck, the room fell silent. The prosecutor began presenting the evidence. The first piece was the video of Noah vandalizing Sophie's car. All eyes turned to the large screen where Noah's face appeared, grinning as he hurled rocks and shattered her window. His childish laughter echoed through the courtroom, but this time no one joined in. Some shook their heads, others whispered in dismay. Claire shot up from her seat, sobbing loudly. "He's just a child! Every child gets into mischief. How can you put my son on display over a silly prank?" The judge had to pound the gavel again, ordering her to sit back down. Next came the TikTok video, the one where Noah tossed Sophie's purse into the pool in the middle of the dinner, while the entire table erupted in laughter. Sophie sat still gripping the edge of her chair as that laughter replayed once more. But this time she wasn't trembling. She turned to Claire and saw her face twisted in despair. Then the prosecutor moved to the financial records, the most crucial part. Loan agreements, credit cards, all in Sophie's name, paired with forensic analysis of the signatures. On the screen, each forged signature was displayed side by side with Sophie's real one. An expert witness confirmed the discrepancies beyond doubt. Sophie's father shot up from his seat, his voice low and harsh. "This is fabricated. We have nothing to do with this." But the prosecutor immediately revealed bank transfers from those fraudulent loans into her parents' joint account and into Claire and Kevin's account. The courtroom erupted with uncontrollable murmurs. Her mother broke down in sobs, clutching the judge's hand as she pleaded, "We only wanted to help our eldest daughter have a better life. Sophie has always been strong and independent, but Claire needed us. It was out of love, not fraud." Her voice trembled, but no one believed her anymore. Sophie looked at her mother, her heart aching, but the truth was clear. Real love never means turning your daughter into a financial shield. The climax came when the judge allowed Sophie to speak. She stood, walked to the wooden podium, and the courtroom fell utterly silent. Sophie looked around and felt every gaze on her judgmental, curious pitying. But this time she did not tremble. Her voice rang out calm but resolute. "I am not suing out of hatred. I am not doing this to get revenge or to humiliate anyone. I am suing to protect my right to exist independently. For years I stayed silent. I let them belittle me, let them use my name as a tool. I kept my teeth clenched, hoping to preserve what they called family. But today, I stand here to say enough. I am no longer a shadow. I want justice to be served, and I want to live a life that belongs to me." When Sophie finished, the room remained mute. She could even hear a pen drop somewhere in the rear. In that moment, she knew that whatever the outcome, she had reclaimed her voice. In the end, the judge delivered the verdict. Noah, being under the age of criminal responsibility, was ordered to participate in a 2-year juvenile rehabilitation program under special supervision. Claire and Kevin were ordered to repay all illegally obtained loans and to pay compensation to Sophie. Her parents were penalized for financial fraud and suffered the loss of their community, standing those who once saw them as a model family now looked at them with contempt. The gavel struck, bringing the trial to a close. Sophie returned to her seat, her legs slightly trembling, but her heart lighter than it had ever been. For the first time in her life, she was no longer a shadow in her own story. She had stood up calm and steady to reclaim her freedom. As she left the courthouse, cameras and microphones swarmed around her. She didn't answer a single question. She simply walked straight ahead, head held high. Inside her echoed one truth: from this moment on, her life would no longer be dictated by anyone else. She was Sophie Hart, and at last, she had stepped out of the shadows. The trial was over, but its aftermath rolled on like relentless waves crashing over the Hart family. Within weeks, the polished facade of the perfect family her parents had spent years constructing lay in ruins. Once they were admired as the model church couple, the stern father, the gentle mother, two daughters so different yet seemingly complementary. But now, when they walked into the local supermarket, they received only whispers, curt nods, or outright avoidance. One woman who had once been close to Sophie's mother told her bluntly, "I can't believe a mother would do that to her own daughter." Just that one sentence left her mother speechless, and the whisper spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Claire, the star, in Sophie's parents' eyes, also fell from her proud pedestal. The boutique she once flaunted on social media could not survive after her name appeared in the financial fraud verdict. Customers canceled orders, en masse partners severed contracts, and the press ran stories about a female boutique owner exposed. The large suburban house that had been the symbol of her manufactured success was finally put up for sale to cover debts. Photos of Claire at lavish champagne parties disappeared, replaced by vague posts online lamenting, "Some people will never understand the sacrifices a family makes." And then Sophie read them and only managed a faint smile because Claire no longer had the power to touch her life. Her parents retreated into silence. Her father stopped attending community meetings, and her mother was no longer invited to speak at the church women's group. Their forced smiles and boastful displays about grandchildren vanished. They shrank into the large house that suddenly felt too big under the weight of quiet. Sophie did not feel triumphant, but she did not pity them either. They were tasting what she had endured for years: imposed loneliness. As for Sophie, she knew she could not stay in Boston forever. Every street corner reminded her of painful memories. After the trial, she received an official offer from an investment fund in Chicago for a senior financial analyst position. It was the job she had always dreamed of, a chance to prove her true worth without needing anyone's approval. She accepted, and a few weeks later she packed her bags and left the small apartment that had been her home for so many years. Before leaving, she closed every joint account that had ever been exploited and canceled all remaining financial ties to her family. Each click, each signature, felt like a declaration: from this moment on, she would no longer be bound to them, no longer let them define her worth. When it was done, she felt as though she had finally removed the last chain. On the day Sophie arrived in Chicago, she carried only a few suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and her laptop. Everything that truly belonged to her. The city welcomed her with its vast sky and vibrant energy. She rented a small but modern apartment with large windows opening onto the deep blue of Lake Michigan. When she moved in, she stood for a long time before the glass, watching the lake sparkle under the afternoon sun. No more nights crying alone in her old Boston apartment. No more angry pounding at her door from Claire. No more endless phone calls. Here, there was only peace. On her first night, she spread fresh sheets across the bed, stacked her books neatly on the shelf, and lit a sandalwood candle. She sat by the wide window of her new home, Lake Michigan, glowing with the colors of sunset before her, its waves shimmering with purple and gold like strokes of a painting. In her hands was a steaming cup of tea, the fragrance of sandalwood filling the room with comfort. For the first time in so long, Sophie allowed herself to sit still, breathe slowly, and look back at everything. The journey she had just lived through felt like a storm. From the night of her graduation, when she was humiliated, to the morning after, when she saw Claire's car being towed away, through the days of threats and insults, and finally to walking into a courtroom to face her entire family. Each moment had cut into her like a knife, but now looking back, she no longer saw a bleeding wound. She saw them as carvings in wood, rough, ugly, but shaping who she was today. She realized something simple that she had been too afraid to admit for years. Family does not always mean love. We are taught that blood is the strongest bond, that no matter who betrays us out there, family is the place we return to. But the truth is different for some people. That house was never a safe haven for Sophie. It was only the place where she learned silence, where she learned to endure, where she learned to be a shadow beside the golden child they chose to praise. She used to blame herself, thinking she wasn't good enough to be loved. But now she understood. Real love never turns a child into an invisible wallet for the rest of the family to exploit. Sophie also came to see something else. Healing does not always mean reconciliation. She once dreamed that one day her family would change, that a belated apology would make up for everything. But holding on to that hope only dragged her deeper into the cycle of disappointment. Healing for Sophie meant letting go. It meant accepting that some relationships must end so that new ones can begin. It meant releasing unrealistic expectations in order to grasp true freedom. A month into her new life in Chicago, Sophie received a letter postmarked from Boston. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. For a moment, she considered throwing it away unopened. But some part of her needed closure, needed to know what her mother could possibly say after everything that had happened. She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Sophie," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. What we did to you is unforgivable. But I need you to know that I think of you every day. I look at the empty chair at our dinner table and remember all the times you sat there silent while we failed to see you. I remember every achievement of yours we brushed aside, every time we put Claire's wants above your needs. I was wrong. We were all wrong. If you ever find it in your heart to speak to me again, even just once, I would be grateful. But I understand if that day never comes. I just wanted you to know that I see you now, though it's far too late. Mom." Sophie read the letter twice, then set it aside on her coffee table. She felt no rush of emotion, no urge to call home, no desire to rebuild what had been broken. Perhaps some days she might want to hear what her mother had to say face to face. Perhaps not. The important thing was that the decision was now entirely hers. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was her new colleague Andrea calling to invite her to dinner with some people from the office. "We're trying this amazing new place on Michigan Avenue," Andrea said. "You in?" "Yes," Sophie replied, surprised by the ease with which the word came. "Yes, I'd love to." As she got ready to go out, Sophie caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow, more present, more solid, as if she now fully occupied the space she stood in. Her first week at the new job had gone better than she could have imagined. Her ideas were heard, her expertise was valued. When she spoke in meetings, people actually listened. It was such a simple thing to be seen to be respected, yet it felt like a revelation after years of being diminished. Sophie checked her appearance one last time, then grabbed her coat. As she closed her apartment door behind her, she felt a sense of possibility that had been absent for most of her life. This was a new beginning, one where she would no longer make herself smaller to accommodate others' egos, no longer accept scraps of affection in place of genuine respect. The Chicago evening was crisp and clear as Sophie walked toward the restaurant. The city lights reflected off Lake Michigan, creating a tapestry of gold and silver on the water's surface. People hurried past strangers with their own stories, their own struggles, their own triumphs. For the first time, Sophie felt like one of them, not separate, not less than not a shadow, just another person making her way in the world on her own terms. The weight she had carried for so long, the constant need to prove her worth, had finally begun to lift. At the restaurant, Andrea waved her over to a table where several colleagues were already seated. "Everyone, this is Sophie, our new financial wizard," she announced. "Not quite a wizard," Sophie replied with a smile. "Just someone who loves what she does." "Well, we're glad to have you," said an older man at the end of the table. "From what I've seen, you're going to be a valuable addition to the team." Sophie thanked him, feeling a warm glow of acceptance. The conversation flowed easily after that, discussions of work mixing with personal anecdotes, questions about her background, which she answered selectively, focusing on her education and professional experience, rather than her family. When someone asked why she'd left Boston, she simply said, "It was time for a change. Sometimes you need to leave the past behind to move forward." They nodded, accepting her answer without pressing for details. Here she was defined by who she was now, not by who her family was or how they had treated her. It was liberating to be known on her own terms. Later that night, back in her apartment, Sophie stood by the window again, looking out at the city that was slowly becoming home. She thought about the letter from her mother still sitting on the coffee table. She thought about Claire, about Noah, about her father. They felt distant now, like characters in a story she had read long ago. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, she doubted it ever would, but it had transformed into something different, something that no longer had the power to define her. Sophie pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window. Outside, Chicago continued its nightly rhythm, cars moving along Lakeshore Drive, lights blinking in distant buildings, the moon casting a silver path across the dark water. And here she was, watching it all, finally the main character in her own life story. 6 months passed in Chicago. Sophie's apartment had taken on more personality, framed prints on the walls, plants thriving on the windowsills, books filling the shelves. Her job had become more than just work. She had been promoted after spearheading a successful investment strategy that impressed senior management. She had made friends, real friends, who valued her for herself, not for what she could do for them. She had even started dating casually, learning to trust that not everyone would use her vulnerability against her. One Sunday morning, as Sophie sipped coffee and read the news on her tablet, a notification appeared. It was from a social media platform she rarely used anymore. A friend request from Noah Hart. Sophie stared at the name, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Noah would be 11 now. She wondered what had prompted this reach out, whether Claire knew about it, whether it was genuine, or another attempt at manipulation. After long consideration, she accepted the request, but set strict privacy boundaries. Almost immediately, a message appeared. "Hi, Aunt Sophie. I'm sorry for what I did to your car and your purse. The therapy lady says I should make amends to people I hurt. I was mean because Mom and Grandpa always said you thought you were better than us. But now I know that wasn't true. I'm sorry." Sophie read the message several times, emotions swirling through her. The apology seemed sincere, the words too thoughtfully constructed to be Claire's coaching. Perhaps the rehabilitation program was actually working. Perhaps Noah was breaking free from the toxic patterns that had been passed down through the Hart family. She typed back a simple response. "Thank you for your apology, Noah. It takes courage to admit when you've done something wrong. I hope you're doing well in the program." His reply came quickly. "It's actually good. I'm learning a lot. Grandpa and Grandma moved away. Mom and Dad are getting divorced. Everything's different now." Sophie felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. Despite what he had done, he was still a child caught in the aftermath of adult mistakes. She hadn't heard about her parents moving or Claire's divorce. She had deliberately avoided news from Boston. But it didn't surprise her. Systems built on deception eventually collapse under their own weight. "I'm sorry things are difficult right now," she wrote back. "Change can be hard, but sometimes it leads to better things." "That's what my therapist says too," Noah replied. "Can I write to you sometimes? Mom doesn't know I'm messaging you. But the therapist says it's good to have different adults to talk to." Sophie considered carefully before responding. "Yes, you can write to me sometimes, but I want you to tell your therapist about our conversations, okay? And I may share things with your therapist if I'm concerned about you. Does that seem fair?" "That's fair," came the answer. "Thanks, Aunt Sophie." As she set her tablet down, Sophie was surprised by the lack of turmoil she felt. A year ago, any contact from her family would have thrown her into emotional chaos. Now she could engage on her own terms with boundaries firmly in place. She could choose to be a positive influence in Noah's life without allowing herself to be manipulated or exploited. That afternoon, Sophie walked along the shore of Lake Michigan, the summer sun warm on her face, the breeze carrying the scent of water and wildflowers. She thought about the strange, unexpected ways life unfolds, how she had gone from feeling trapped and invisible to building a life of freedom and possibility, how she had feared that cutting ties with her family would leave her with nothing only to discover it had given her everything. Maybe someday she would have a conversation with her mother. Maybe she would eventually meet Noah face to face when he was older. Maybe not. The beauty was that these were choices now, not obligations. She could decide what relationships to nurture and which ones to leave behind. As the sun began its descent, casting long golden rays across the water, Sophie found a quiet spot to sit. She watched the waves gently lapping at the shore, each one reaching forward, then receding in an endless peaceful rhythm. There was something comforting about the constancy of the lake, the way it changed and yet remained the same. Sophie thought about all the people who had come to the lakefront before her, generations of Chicago residents finding solace in this vast body of water. She was just one more person writing her story against this backdrop. The thought was both humbling and liberating. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath of the lake air, feeling gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for Julia, who had stood beside her when it mattered most. Gratitude for her new colleagues and friends who saw her strengths without trying to diminish them. Gratitude even for the painful journey that had led her here, because without it, she might never have found the courage to claim her own life. The setting sun cast long shadows across the shore, reminding Sophie of how far she had come from being a shadow herself. Now she stood in full light, casting her own shadow rather than living as someone else's. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sophie rose to her feet and began the walk back to her apartment. The Chicago skyline glittered before her, each light a reminder of possibilities still unfolding. In her pocket, her phone vibrated with a message from a colleague inviting her to a dinner party the following weekend. Sophie smiled and typed back a quick acceptance. This was her life now, filled with connections she had chosen, work that fulfilled her, and a future limited only by her own imagination, not by others' expectations. Back in her apartment, she made a simple dinner and ate by the window, watching the city lights reflect off the lake. After washing her dishes, she settled into her favorite chair, with a book she'd been meaning to read for weeks. The peace that surrounded her wasn't just in the quiet of her apartment or the absence of conflict. It was within her, a hard-won tranquility born of standing up for herself, of refusing to be erased, of choosing self-respect over the illusion of family harmony. Sophie set her book aside and walked to the window one last time before heading to bed. The city sprawled before her, Lake Michigan, a vast darkness beyond. She placed her palm against the cool glass and whispered words that had become something of a mantra. I am no longer the family's silent wallet. I am Sophie Hart, and I am free. 2 years after moving to Chicago, Sophie stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, looking out at the sea of faces watching her with admiration. The Investment Strategy Award for Innovation shimmered under the crystal chandeliers as she held it in her hands, tangible proof of what she had always known about herself, but that her family had refused to see. Thank you, she began, her voice steady and confident. This award recognizes not just financial innovation, but the courage to challenge established thinking. Sometimes the most important investment we make is in ourselves. From her table near the front, her colleagues from Lakefront Capital rose in a standing ovation. Among them was Daniel, the firm's research director, whose admiring gaze had slowly evolved into something more over their months of working together. Their first date was scheduled for the following weekend, a milestone Sophie had approached with both caution and genuine excitement. Later that evening, Sophie walked along the Chicago waterfront, award in hand, the spring air carrying the promise of renewal. 3 years had passed since that fateful graduation dinner, since her purse had sunk to the bottom of a pool while her family laughed. Sometimes the memory still surfaced, but now it came without the sharp sting of humiliation, without the heavy weight of betrayal. She found her favorite bench overlooking the lake and sat down watching the moonlight dance across the water. She had built something beautiful here, a career where her talents were recognized, friendships based on mutual respect, a small but vibrant circle that had slowly become the family she chose. Last weekend, she had hosted her first dinner party in her new apartment, the laughter and warmth filling every corner. Healing places inside her she hadn't known were still broken. Sophie reached into her purse and pulled out the worn photograph she kept there, the only picture of herself as a child that she had brought from Boston. In it, she was about 7 years old, standing straight and serious in front of her school, holding a perfect report card. I wish I could tell you, she whispered to her younger self, that it wasn't your fault, that you were always enough, that one day you would find people who see your light instead of trying to dim it. She traced the outline of the little girl's face with her finger, feeling a surge of tenderness and finally forgiveness, not for her family, but for herself. For all the years she had stayed silent, for all the time she had believed their narrative about her worth, for every moment she had made herself smaller to avoid rocking the boat. As she tucked the photo away, Sophie realized she no longer needed to carry it. The child in that picture wasn't lost anymore. She had been reclaimed, healed, and integrated into the woman Sophie had become. The Chicago skyline glittered before her, each light a reminder of possibilities still unfolding. Tomorrow she would meet with Noah's therapist about her nephew's progress. Next month, she would present her investment strategy at an international conference. In the fall, she planned to start volunteering at a financial literacy program for young women. This was her life now, rich with purpose, connection, and joy. A life built on her own terms, with boundaries that protected her heart and possibilities that expanded her horizons. Sophie stood feeling the cool breeze from Lake Michigan against her face and whispered the words that had become both her mantra and her truth. I am no longer defined by what was done to me. I am Sophie Hart, and my story is just beginning.